I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak at this 2020 BSPA conference and for persevering and making it happen. In the 21st century, governments still depend a lot on citizens self-reporting what they've been up to. Workers and businesses self-report their income and sales for tax purposes. Polluters self-report their water and air emissions and their handling of hazardous wastes. As you might imagine, these reporters may not have incentives to be completely accurate in their self-reports. In 2012, an influential study reported that you can induce people to self-report more accurately if you have them sign a statement that attests to the truth and accuracy of their report before they self-report rather than afterward, which is more typical. Inspired by that study, US federal employees ran a randomized trial with what is known as the Industrial Funding Fee Program. I'm sure some of you have heard about this trial in prior BSPA conferences. If you haven't, all you need to know about this program is that when the government purchases goods or services from a vendor, the vendor has to report the sales to the government and pay an administrative fee based on their self-reported sales. You might be asking, why is the government asking vendors to report what they sold to the government? That's a question for another presentation. Here I just want to focus on the trial. To try to induce more accurate self-reporting of sales, the government placed a required signature box at the top of the online reporting form for a random sample of visitors. They just had to read, "I promise that the information I am providing is true and accurate," type their signature, and then fill out their form. The control group signed the box after they filled out the form, which was the status quo. In the first quarter, after the intervention launched, the staff estimated that moving the box from the bottom to the top of the online form generated an additional $1.6 million in fees collected. Based on that 1 quarter of data, the Government Services Administration, which runs the program, said they would update the software so everyone had to sign the box in the future. But they didn't update the software. It wasn't on purpose, but they left the system intact so that the group that was signing at the top continued to sign at the top, and the group that signed at the bottom continued to sign at the bottom. And although that inaction may have disappointed the original staff that ran the trial, it allowed others to go back and look at the reporting in the 2nd through 5th quarters after the intervention was launched. Remember, the results from the trial were based on the results from the 1st quarter after the intervention. In the later quarters, the researchers couldn't detect any differences in the fees collected from the intervention group or the control group. The effect detected in the 1st quarter seems to have waned. And I tell you this story because it highlights 2 important issues related to the application of behavioral science insights to environmental and energy programs. First, the persistence of behavior change is paramount in energy and environmental contexts. That's why the most popular word for describing the objective of activities in this domain is sustainability. We want people to pollute less, not just today, but every day. We want people to use less energy or use cleaner energy, not just in one day, but all the days. We want people to consume less meat persistently. Persistent behavior change is what we want. And my second point is that although persistence is paramount, behavioral scientists don't know much about persistence. Now look, we're all here at this conference because we believe that insights from the behavioral sciences can improve public policies and programs. I'm a believer. I direct or co-direct 2 centers, EPIC and CBEAR, that work with governmental and non-governmental organizations to bring these insights to the environmental and energy domains and test them in the field. But there are important gaps in our knowledge that we need to fill in if we're going to harness behavioral science for environmental goals. Today I want to talk about one of those gaps: how little we know about the persistence of the behavior changes that we claim we can bring about. And the problem is that most behavioral studies are very short-term. Right? Much of the evidence that we have comes from laboratory experiments, and those are typically just a momentary behavior change. Field experiments typically run longer, but not by much. I looked at nearly 60 field experiments testing behavioral science-inspired interventions published in the last 10 years. More than half of them studied behaviors for which sustained behavior change would be desirable from a policy perspective. In those studies, the median period of time after the intervention was 2.6 months. On an environmental time scale, that's the equivalent of a sneeze. Only 3 of the studies looked at behavior more than a year after the intervention. Now, there's some evidence on persistence. For example, many of you are familiar with peer or social comparisons in your energy and water bills. A few experiments suggest that these comparisons can induce sustained behavior change over several years, even after the comparisons are no longer being sent. And that last result really excites a lot of my program collaborators because I work with a lot of people who hope that short-term interventions can lead to long-term behavior change. And it's a hope that's fueled by lack of money to do any long-term interventions. And for example, Department of Agriculture invests billions every year in short-term incentive contracts with farmers. These are 1 to 3 year contracts for them to try out agricultural practices that reduce environmental impacts. The hope is that short-term exposure to these practices will lead to persistent use of the practices long after the contracts have ended. That hope's plausible. Greater exposure could enhance persistence through at least 3 mechanisms. The first 2, habituation and learning by doing, are very similar even mathematically, but they're roughly the idea that exposure to a behavior, a practice, a technology, or product leads to changes in my perceptions of the net benefits from that use or that behavior. And that's going to make it more likely that I continue using that practice or that product over time. Very similarly, experience goods are goods that I can't really judge whether they're good for me or bad for me until I actually experience, actually do the behavior or do the practice. And many of these practices, let's hope, that have that sort of attribute. So exposure gives us information, gives the user information that makes it more likely to see the net benefits from the practice and therefore more likely to use the practice, do the behavior over time. And we're starting to develop experimental evidence that these mechanisms are active and they can be enhanced through changes in program features. So I don't want you to think that we have no reason to believe that behavioral science-inspired interventions can lead to persistent behavior change. But it's important to understand this research is in its infancy. And it's my belief, I'm willing to debate afterward, that behavioral science-inspired interventions are best for one-and-done actions, like insulating your attic. Actions for which persistence, at least in the medium term, is not the main objective. Right? So it's good for switching people from an energy supplier that uses dirty energy to another supplier that uses cleaner energy. It's good for getting people to switch from a less fuel-efficient car to a more fuel-efficient car. Getting people to change their home to make it more energy or water efficient. In fact, one of those peer comparison studies in energy consumption that was able to detect long-term persistent changes in energy use found that you could still detect reductions in energy use in the homes after the original occupants had moved out. There were no more comparisons being sent, and the people that were in those homes were not the people that actually received the peer comparisons, yet the homes had reduced energy use compared to control groups. And that suggests that the occupants, when they received these peer comparisons, actually changed the home itself so that you would get these persistent behavior changes and persistent reductions in energy use over time. But these sorts of behavioral interventions are not likely to be effective for changing behaviors like your food or your transportation choices. In other words, those actions where persistent behavior change is required. And in these cases, change is most likely to be effectively induced by traditional economic approaches that directly affect prices, using taxes, subsidies, or innovations, technological innovations, such as innovations that lead to improved taste or lower cost for vegetarian meat alternatives. Right? But we can debate that. What's really clear is we need more long-term testing. There are often arguments that the behavioral science-inspired interventions, adding a box at the top of the form, changing the framing of incentive contracts, making behaviors visible to peers, these interventions are, quote, costless. And so even if the behavior change isn't persistent, they're still worth doing. I work closely with federal and state agencies and NGOs in the environmental space. And none of those changes would be considered costless in those agencies. And just as importantly, the agencies are not going to do all the potential interventions we can come up with. And they're going to test even fewer of those. So the opportunity cost of choosing one intervention rather than another can be quite large if there's an intervention out there that can lead to persistent behavior change and we don't choose it. So a lot of you in the audience, academics and practitioners, are embedding behavioral experiments in real-world programs. We all want successful programs to be scaled up. Too few of them are, I understand that. Many of us have the experience of running a field trial, getting some promising results, and getting dead silence from the higher-ups in response. Nevertheless, we need more evidence on persistence. So my final ask is please try to leave some of your experimental groups intact and follow up on them, at least a year later, if not longer. We need incentives to do these extended trials. I'm not imagining that miraculously we're going to start doing them because I say so. Right? So if you're a boss of an organization out there, I'm asking you to be more interested in these extended trials. Don't just declare victory after a month or less and move on. Editors and peer reviewers of scientific journals, if you're out there, I'm asking you to be more interested in this work. Don't tell authors that the effects persist. It's not interesting because we knew they would, or it doesn't persist. It's not interesting because we can't explicitly figure out what caused the effect to wane. Now, with long-term evaluations, we can start to fix an important blind spot in the evidence for applying behavioral insights to achieve environmental and energy goals. I'm not claiming that environmental and energy areas are the only policy areas where persistent behavior change is important. And all policy areas, to some extent, have objectives that require persistent behavior change. Health is a great example. But persistence is at the core of environmental and energy problems. And for behavioral science to fully contribute to solving those problems, we'll need to shed a lot more light on how behavioral insights can best make changes that last. Thank you.